It was supposed to be the ultimate power move, Trump's export bans, cutting China off from the chips that drive the modern world. But somewhere between the headlines and the loopholes, China walked right through the back door. In just 2 years, Beijing quietly acquired $38 billion in advanced U.S. and allied chip-making tools, enough to supercharge its tech ambitions, while Washington celebrated a win. The real story? America's control plan just armed its rival.
When the Trump administration announced its first wave of export bans in 2019, the mission seemed simple: starve China's semiconductor industry of the machines and software needed to build advanced chips. The logic was straightforward: no tools, no technology, no threat. But in the world of global supply chains, control is a mirage. At the center of this story is ASML in the Netherlands, Tokyo Electron in Japan, and Applied Materials in California. Companies whose machines etch circuits so small they make the heart of modern technology possible. These tools don't just build phones and cars, they build the future itself. So when Washington moved to block China's access, the world watched to see how Beijing would react. Beijing didn't react, it adapted, fast. According to a 2024 U.S. House Select Committee report, Chinese companies imported roughly $38 billion worth of semiconductor manufacturing tools from U.S. and allied nations after those restrictions took effect. How? Through loopholes, third-country re-exports, and gray zone subsidiaries operating from Singapore to Malaysia. The rules restricted only leading-edge tools for nodes below 14 nanometers, but left thousands of legacy machines untouched. Guess which ones China bought in bulk? All of them. In fact, Beijing's chip equipment imports from the Netherlands surged by over 100% in just 1 year. Japan and South Korea showed similar spikes. Every shipment was technically legal, every transaction logged, and yet the strategic goal, contain China, was already slipping away. Back in Silicon Valley, U.S. firms like Applied Materials felt the pain first. In November 2024, it warned shareholders of a $710 million revenue loss due to tightened export curbs. Executives called it an unavoidable collateral damage. Analysts called it a policy boomerang. Applied Materials is not alone. Lam Research, KLA, and Synopsys, each a cornerstone of America's semiconductor dominance, now spend millions on compliance teams instead of R&D. Their Chinese clients once accounted for up to a third of annual sales. That pipeline is closing fast, and jobs at home are quietly drying up. For the engineers in Austin and the technicians in Portland, the China ban is no victory. It's a pink slip in slow motion. When Reuters broke the numbers, $38 billion in acquisitions since the ban, even members of the U.S. House Select Committee on China were stunned. They had spent years claiming decoupling was working. The truth was that the restrictions pushed sales off the books, but not out of reach. The reality is mathematical. For every machine blocked, China found 2 older ones to buy. For every design tool restricted, it developed a local copy through joint ventures or reverse engineering. By 2024, Beijing had reportedly commissioned over 30 new semiconductor plants, most equipped with Western tools that had somehow escaped the net. In Washington, each announcement was marketed as a win. Sanctions tightened, licenses revoked, pressure mounting. But while politicians claimed progress, data from the U.S. Commerce Department told another story. Exports to China rose in value even as their official categories shifted into legacy equipment. That's bureaucratic language for we reclassified the same tools.
Behind closed doors, executives warned the White House that over-tightening would only hurt domestic firms and help foreign competitors. Japan and the Netherlands dragged their feet on matching restrictions, arguing that U.S. rules were too broad. By the time consensus arrived in 2024, China had already stockpiled enough equipment to last years. Picture a machine the size of a small truck, a lithography system that costs $200 million. It can't simply be hidden. So how did billions in these machines cross borders? Through joint ventures, intermediate warehouses, and friendly ports that served as transit zones. A tool sold from the U.S. to Singapore can be resold to a Malaysian firm and then leased to a Chinese fab, all perfectly legal, on paper. Even software wasn't immune. When Synopsys halted China sales under new export rules, its design tools continued to appear through subsidiaries licensed to non-Chinese entities. The digital border is even harder to police than the physical one. By late 2024, the export crackdown had triggered a different kind of race, a reshuffling of global alliances. South Korea's Samsung and SK Hynix had special waivers to ship tools to their Chinese plants, When those were revoked in 2025, entire supply chains froze. Fabs in Xi'an and Wuxi stood half silent, waiting for approval that never came. Billions of dollars in equipment were stuck in customs, too valuable to abandon, too restricted to move.
Investors panicked, Korean stock indices dipped, chip shortages loomed again just as inflation began to cool. For the average American, it showed up as a price tag, higher costs for electronics, delays in car production, and a ripple of job cuts from California to Texas. Policy intended to secure national interests was now tightening the screws on ordinary families. Beijing did not stay quiet. Just before a Trump-Xi summit, China tightened rare earth export controls, granting the government power to block material shipments even to foreign-owned plants inside China. Rare earths are the bloodline of everything from EV batteries to fighter jets. Cut that supply, and the entire global production chain wobbles. Analysts called it a strategic counterpunch. Washington called it economic coercion. But the message was simple: two can play this game. What's emerging isn't just a trade war, it's a re-engineering of global power. The United States built the rules of technology, China is now testing their limits. Every restriction creates a shadow market, every ban creates a new supplier, and every lost sale creates a new competitor. By the time US officials realized the loopholes were bleeding billions, Chinese chip output was rising again. Even without access to cutting-edge EUV lithography, China had mastered 28 and even 14-nanometer production, good enough for cars, phones, and missiles. The goal was never to match the West overnight, it was to survive long enough to replace it.
Now Washington faces a paradox. Tighten controls further and risk crippling its own companies, or loosen them and watch Beijing race ahead. It's a trap built by its own strategy. And while lawmakers debate, the machines keep moving, quietly, legally, profitably, across borders America no longer controls. We expose how this $38 billion backdoor is reshaping the entire global tech map. Who built it, who's benefiting now, and what happens if the next ban fails. The loophole wasn't just a crack in policy, it became an industry. Freight forwarders, shell importers, and joint venture subsidiaries all found one truth. Where Washington draws a line, profit draws a map. By early 2025, Chinese customs data confirmed it. Imports of chip-making gear from US allies hit record highs, even as official exports from America fell. The missing piece in between? A gray network of middlemen converting embargoes into opportunity. Not everyone lost. Japanese toolmakers like Tokyo Electron and Hitachi High-Tech reported double-digit revenue jumps from indirect sales. Dutch and Korean suppliers too. Their parts shipped through partners, labeled as maintenance kits, legacy upgrades, spare modules. Every label was true enough to pass customs, false enough to blur intent. Meanwhile, American firms, under tight scrutiny, watched their competitors fill the gap they once owned. Applied Materials bled $710 million. Tokyo Electron gained $2 billion. That's not geopolitics, that's market gravity.
Beijing's strategy wasn't improvisation, it was infrastructure. Years before the bans, China launched the Golden Tool Program, a government fund pairing local fabs with global suppliers willing to localize production. When restrictions hit, factories in Suzhou and Shenzhen simply switched order routes. US chips still arrived, just with a different flag on the invoice. The proof sits in trade sheets. Shanghai Microelectronics now produces domestic lithography systems that mirror older ASML models. Not identical, not cutting edge, but good enough and made legal by time. China didn't need perfection, it needed persistence. Washington still speaks of decoupling, but look closer. Apple's iPhones, Tesla's battery plants, Nvidia's GPU contracts all depend on Chinese manufacturing nodes that use these same legacy tools. Full separation would implode supply chains overnight. So policymakers talk de-risking, not divorcing. Different word, same marriage. And every quarter, the numbers prove it. China remains the largest single buyer of semiconductor manufacturing equipment on Earth. Control has become a slogan, dependency the reality. Behind every policy chart is a paycheck. In Texas, a technician who once calibrated wafer systems for export lines is now on furlough. In Oregon, a small parts supplier shut its doors after Beijing orders vanished. These aren't national security wins, they're neighborhood losses. Workers trained for decades in a global ecosystem are discovering what isolation really costs, their own stability. Meanwhile, the prices of laptops, cars, and appliances edge upward. What began as a geopolitical firewall is now a household expense.
Inside Congress, two camps are forming. One wants to double down, close every loophole, tighten every license, even if allies rebel. The other warns that overreach will only push neutral nations toward Beijing's orbit. The reality, enforcement is expensive. Monitoring thousands of re-exports across Asia requires satellites, inspectors, and data tracking on a scale no agency currently owns. And every delay lets another shipment slip through. South Korea, Japan, and the Netherlands, America's indispensable partners, are caught in a tug of war. They rely on China for customers, but on the U.S. for protection. When Washington revoked waivers for Intel, Samsung, and SK Hynix fabs inside China, the shock hit Seoul harder than Beijing. Korean analysts estimate that halting even one advanced fabrication line could erase $10 billion in output and thousands of jobs. In Tokyo, officials privately call the policy unsustainable diplomacy. Publicly, they nod. Privately, they hedge. While the West debates, Beijing acts. The rare earth export law passed before the Trump-Xi summit was just the opening shot. By 2025, new restrictions covered gallium, germanium, and graphite, critical for semiconductors and EVs alike. The timing wasn't random. Each move answered a U.S. ban, chip for chip, metal for metal. This tit-for-tat squeezed American manufacturers already facing inflation and labor costs. Defense contractors warned of shortages in radar systems. Automakers delayed electric models. For the first time, the phrase supply chain warfare entered official hearings.
The rest of the world is watching and learning. India, Malaysia, and Vietnam are racing to host neutral fabs that serve both superpowers. Europe's Chip Act now mirrors Washington's tone, but not its teeth, choosing subsidies over sanctions. Economists see the $38 billion loophole as a warning shot. If advanced technology can leak across borders despite the most aggressive sanctions ever attempted, then control itself may be obsolete. You can police weapons, you can't police electrons. Investors have already picked a side: profit. Semiconductor indices rebounded as traders realized the bans wouldn't last forever. Every headline about national security was followed by a surge in workaround stocks, logistics firms, neutral country suppliers, gray market brokers. Markets are rarely moral, they're mathematical. And the math says, someone will always sell. While Washington debates and Beijing maneuvers, technology keeps advancing. Artificial intelligence, quantum computing, autonomous vehicles, all depend on chips. Every month, a nation delays access, another finds a shortcut. If China's 28-nanometer chips can power drones, tanks, and telecoms today, what happens when it reaches 10 nanometers tomorrow? The bans bought time, but time, like technology, depreciates fast.
Behind closed doors, U.S. agencies are drafting a new phase, less about punishment, more about partnership. Plans include joint R&D funds with allies, stricter export tracking software, and incentives for domestic chip plants under the CHIPS Act. But rebuilding capacity takes years, not headlines. By the time the first Arizona fab hits full output, China will have produced thousands of additional legal legacy chips. It's not a race for dominance anymore, it's a race for resilience. For decades, Americans assumed technological leadership was permanent. The $38 billion loophole shattered that illusion. It showed that advantage is fragile, a balance of trust, coordination, and vigilance. When any link breaks, the world finds a way around it. Even inside government briefings, one phrase keeps repeating: control is temporary. Every sanction, every ban, every line on a map, temporary. Because innovation doesn't recognize borders, it recognizes demand. Analysts now predict that by 2026, China's domestic chip tool industry will reach 70% self-sufficiency. That means the window for leverage is closing. America's challenge is no longer to stop China, it's to out-innovate it. The coming year will test whether subsidies, alliances, and strategy can replace brute bans. Because if loopholes remain, the next control measure could leak not billions, but entire generations of technology. The story began as a trade measure and became a mirror. It reflects how globalization, once America's strength, can now rewrite its intentions overnight. It reveals that in the race for silicon supremacy, no one truly wins. They only postpone losing.
$38 billion isn't just a statistic. It's a symptom of how hard it is to contain a world that's already connected. And for every policy drafted in Washington, a new workaround is written in Shenzhen. So, the question that remains, and perhaps the only one that matters, is this. If control creates its own opposition, how do you lead without losing the world that depends on you?